there further discussion on the, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez, you're recognized.
I'd like to yield my time to Representative Huffman.
I thank the gentlelady, and I think there's an important clarification needed here. The definition that my colleague from Oregon has provided, the different conditions and qualities that have to exist for critical habitat, is consistent with the ESA as to occupied habitat. But the problem with the gentleman's legislation is it applies those same standards to unoccupied habitat, and that is inconsistent with the ESA. The ESA is meant to provide flexibility for habitat that can be restored or modified and nevertheless be critical to a species recovery. So it absolutely constrains the ability to use the critical habitat tool to support the expansion of a species range. It absolutely creates a motivation for landowners and others to shoot, shovel, and shut up, because the presence of an endangered species is certainly a strong piece of evidence that those characteristics would exist. But more fundamentally, it strips away the flexibility that the ESA was always meant to provide to allow restoration and modification of habitat if that is necessary to recover a species and prevent it from going extinct. With that, I yield.
Gentleman yields. The gentlelady reserved for time. Gentlelady yields back. Is there any further discussion on the resolution? Hearing none, is now in order to consider amendments to HJ Res 46. I recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Huffman, for the purpose of offering his amendment designated Huffman number 1. Without objection,
Mr. Chair.
Mr. Stauber.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
The gentleman reserves a point of order. The gentleman from California, Mr. Huffman, is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do urge my colleagues to oppose this resolution, and I want to just talk for a moment about some things that our colleague from Florida, Ms. Luna, said recently in a refreshing statement of support for protection of sea turtles in Florida. In fact, it's the first time I think I've ever heard a colleague across the aisle actually urge federal officials to do more to protect a threatened species, and even urge them to list them under the Endangered Species Act. It was wonderful, and I appreciated it. And she asked how many of us care about sea turtles, and a lot of hands went up around this room. That too was really refreshing. Now, sea turtles, like a lot of species, occupy areas with preferred characteristics like temperature, food availability, and suitability for nesting. As climate change intensifies and sea levels rise, the areas sea turtles currently occupy will no longer have those preferred qualities and characteristics, and sea turtles are going to migrate to new areas. We're already seeing this along the eastern seaboard. If this resolution passes and the Trump habitat rule with its narrow constraint on critical habitat is reinstated, it would become much more difficult to designate these new areas as critical habitat, and that would hinder the recovery of the species. So look, we've heard a lot, especially from one colleague from Florida, and I celebrate that and I applaud it, about caring about species in Florida like the loggerhead turtle, manatees, piping plover. I think it's important to reflect on how this damaging change in the definition of critical habitat would affect all of those species. Now, I'm not a scientist, and neither are any of you. That's kind of the point. We really need to allow career scientists and experts in compliance with the Endangered Species Act mandate to manage species based on best available science to do their job and not tie their hands. With that, Mr. Chair, I do understand that there once again is a germaneness objection that will prevent this amendment from being considered. And I will once again point out that that sort of makes my point, that you are moving forward with legislation that has no backstop. This amendment would have provided that backstop, that if science-based wildlife management concludes we need to expand critical habitat ranges, that Fish and Wildlife officials could do that. But you don't want that backstop, which again suggests just how extreme and dangerous this legislation is. So I will withdraw the amendment because of my colleague's germaneness objection and urge my colleagues to vote no on the legislation. Yield back.
Without objection, the amendment is withdrawn.
Mr. Chair, I withdraw my reservation.
And without objection, the reservation is withdrawn. Are there any further amendments? Hearing none, I move that the Committee on Natural Resources favorably report H.J. Res. 46. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. A recorded vote has been requested. Further proceedings on H.J. Res. 46 will be postponed.